Welcome to Adobe Dimensions. This is Adobe's answer to easy to create 3D objects and now 3D typography, which is our big trend for 2021 is hyper-realistic 3D typography. So we've created 3D objects in Photoshop before in lessons, but we're going to take it a much step further into Adobe Dimensions. I teach the very basics of Adobe Dimensions and how to work with 3D objects and software in other courses and other lessons. So we're not going to focus on the basics of Adobe Dimensions. We're going to focus once again on the trends at hand, which is how to create really realistic 3D typography. So I thought the best thing to do is just give you a tour of two different 3D typography projects I did, and then we're going to create one ourselves using the software. So you can see this is the file I have for my 2021 cover photo I have for the course and for the lessons and how I advertised my 2021 Design Trends lessons. You can see this is where I created it. It doesn't look very exciting right now, but this is kind of when I press the render button, which it then renders the final lighting and refraction and effects. It looks a lot better after that. But before that, when you're in the software, it doesn't seem too impressive until you get it rendered and you can see all those effects really happening. I think one of the hardest things about learning 3D software for the first time is getting used to the two different ways to move around a 3D space, and that is moving the objects themselves and then moving the camera angle. So there's two totally different things happening. You have a camera angle, and then you have the object's position and angle in a space. And both of those are like two separate things. I found that to be the hardest thing to work in a 3D space. So when I go over those basic lessons in that other course, I kind of go over how to kind of move. These are kind of your movement tools, and these are kind of your object tools. So this is how you move objects. So if I press the select tool, I can take this number 2 and I can move it along 3D space. So I can move it on the Z axis, the X axis, move it down, and of course in 3D you have a Y. You have 3 different axes you can move it. So you can move it forward, side, all different kinds of ways. And then you have, that's all your movement tools. And then you have all your camera angles. So camera angle is going to be different. It's not going to change the position of the 3D object, but it's going to change your view of the project. So if I have, this is dolly, so I'm going to dolly out. So if you're used to camera stuff, it has the same terminology as camera work. So we're going to dolly out, and you can see the entire artboard here. And then I can orbit. So I'm just going to orbit around, and this is how you kind of set the angle and the view of your final render, which is sometimes just as important as the objects themselves, is the angle that you have of it. And then lastly, we have pan. So pan is going to kind of pan around the object. And in this case, you can see how it's not super duper complicated how I created those numbers, just some effects and materials and lighting on some numbers. We have a couple of default little shapes that come free with Adobe Dimensions. This is a little torus shape right here, and then we have just some squares. So that is kind of how I created those letters. I'm going to show you one more. And the reason why I wanted to show you a couple of finished projects to show you how approachable and easy 3D typography can be, especially in Adobe Dimensions, which I feel like is so much more simplified and easier to use than Blender. Blender's great, but it's going to take hours and hours of practice to learn Blender. Well, the only thing about Adobe Dimensions is there's not the ability to animate like Blender has. It's going to be static 3D. So this is the typography poster that I created here. It's just got some gold material. All of these letters are individual letters. So I just used this type tool right here and dragged in some text and typed in one character at a time. And I was able to kind of stack them and have different depths so that when you bring them together, they kind of hug each other. And it's really very similar to flat typography and flat characters. It's the same thing I would do in Adobe Illustrator, but I'm just doing it in a 3D space. So it's not really too intimidating, and putting in the right material and lighting effects, that adds a little complexity, but overall the way I'm balancing the characters and the spacing between the characters is just the same as flat 2D design. You're just bringing in that extra 3D element. And when I dolly out, you can see I put everything in this little box, and what that does is it gives it a background, it gives it a frame, so that it's not floating in a white space. So that's the only reason why I put in that box, and that's just a simple shape. If you go down here, you have some basic shapes. This is your starter assets. You have some basic shapes you can bring into your 3D space. You have some models, and this is just a hollow cube that I brought in and then changed the material and kind of put it almost like a photo box, like you would when you're taking a photo of something in real life, kind of control the lighting and the environment a little bit better in that little box. It's not an object floating in space. So let's create a new document so we can really get a handle of 3D typography. So I'm just going to go to File, New, and it's going to open up a new 3D space. So here's our default 3D space. We're just going to focus on text, this text tool. This is brand new to, and I think in early 2020. And this is why it's a trend now, because it makes 3D type so easy. So I've just brought it in to the 3D space, and we can move this around. We can move the arrows up to move the object along the 3D space. We can make it smaller by adjusting the squares here so we can scale. So this is movement, the little cone here, and the squares along each axis is sizing it. So we can kind of scale it, make it smaller, and move. This is probably the hardest part about working in a 3D space, is really getting to know how to scale and move your objects. And so to move it, see these little circles? I'm going to be able to rotate. So the circles are rotating, the squares are scaling, and the cones are kind of moving along the axis and the line. So there's kind of 3 different little elements that you just have to kind of get used to. I do this a little bit in the lessons. And if you ever want to get it right on this baseline grid, you can click the middle, and it's going to align it to the surface. So right there's the surface of my 3D space. And of course we can change the camera angle. We have a couple of options. We have orbit, pan, and dolly. So these are all going to do something different. Dolly's going to bring it in. Orbit's going to orbit around. You can go all the way into the sky. And you got to use a combination of a couple of these to really bring everything together. So let's go ahead and type in our type. So I have my object selected, just doing the select tool. And I'm going to go down here to my text and just type in, we're going to do 2021. And I want to do a different effect for each letter. So I'm going to type in 2, and I'm going to scale this, make it bigger. Woo. And then I'm going to move it along the axis right here. And there is 2. And right now it's on Arial. We don't have to use Arial. I know everybody I know will have Arial, so I might stick with it just because I know everybody will have access to that font. So let's just keep it to Arial. Let's keep it on regular. But if you ever wanted to change the kerning, the spacing, the size, all that's right here in this area. So what I like to do is I'm just going to copy this 2. We're going to do Command C, Command V, and copy. And what we could do is we can kind of change the camera. So you got to change that camera angle often to kind of get a perspective you like. So you can be able to move this how you like. So I'm going to move along the Z, and it's going to move it kind of diagonal, kind of in a diagonal position. A little bit awkward, that's okay. And what I'm going to do, and this is the cool thing about 3D typography, you can have it layered. So in flat 2D, we layer things by adding shadows and other things. But this, we can literally layer this thing and have them on different planes, which is really cool. So we can do like 20, and then we can duplicate this. And then have this be 2021. We can layer this on top, so I'm going to bring that over, bring that back. Just trying to find the right position for this. And then duplicate it again, typing in 1 in the text box. And you want to make sure the 1 is readable, so let's make sure enough of the 1 is visible that you can read it. What's cool is I've seen it like the example I showed about 3D typography, where you can have things kind of coming together. You don't have to have them all on the same plane going across. You can have things angled. So let's say we have this 2, or this 2 and the 1. We can bring this 1 forward. We can rotate it on a different plane even. So I mean, just you got to really, when thinking, it's a totally different space to kind of think about. And then you can, of course, orbit this and get, so you can see how you can create some pretty cool stuff. I'm going to go back to what I had. I can always change the angle slightly, kind of give it more of this broken up look, so that I'm just taking the move tool, selecting each letter, just doing a little rotating. And what's cool, it's going to catch light at different angles too. So if I have this at a different angle, it's going to catch light differently than the other angles, which kind of gives it a dynamic look. We have 3 axes. So we can even do a rotate X. So I'm going to rotate X. You can have them be flat down. I mean, you can do everything you want here with 3D typography. This is what's so cool about it, is it's so many endless possibilities. And we can bring that up. We can even have that be floating if we wanted to. So now we can apply certain effects. So what I want to do is I want to dolly in a little bit, frame it a little better. And I'm just going to do my pan. These are just my camera tools. I'm just going to do the camera. I'm going to go ahead and save it. And what we're going to do next is we're going to be able to apply different materials to this to really make this, instead of flat being matte, we can really apply lots of different materials and even do some bevels.